All right. Hey, everybody. I'm going to start adding some audio reviews to my blog just because I think some books warrant discussion. And one of the cool things was that my writing partner, author of King Space Void and Fruition, Anthony Trevino, and I both recently read the same book. So we really wanted to talk about Little Heaven, which is obviously the book we're talking about today. And Little Heaven, it's funny because when we both read it, we both thought it was a masterpiece, and or at least I did. And we've been finding a lot of detractors online, and so we really wanted to discuss this book at length. But so what we're going to do is we're going to do about maybe 5, 10 minutes, depending how we feel, of talking about the book without spoilers, and then just to get into like the kind of writing nitty gritty and the things we enjoyed about the book, we'll do spoilers after that, but you'll get a good spoiler warning. So, anyways, Anthony, you read the book first. Your initial thoughts on Little Heaven?
I wish we had done this a little while ago because I'm 3 or 4 books away from Little Heaven now. But I think my initial thoughts about Little Heaven were that I was impressed that Nick Cutter was able to tell such an interesting story within 3 different timelines. It's 3, right?
Well, I think it's mostly two.
It's mostly 2.
Yeah, mostly two. The '60s and the '80s.
Yep, this is why we should have done this earlier, man.
Yeah.
I was impressed with the level of detail in backstory for each of the characters, which is something that comes up a lot in reviews when I was scrolling through Amazon, was that people were mentioning that there's too much exposition for each character, which, I didn't really get that impression a whole lot.
I found that to be a strength of the book. As a matter of fact, if you look at some of the characters like Ebenezer and Winnie, especially Winnie, I thought her backstory with her suicide attempts and everything, I thought were really fascinating and made her interesting characters. And I thought the characters were offbeat, weird, strange in a way that made them very interesting, personally. But yeah, so I, that's kind of how I felt about the characters. Now, I am on to the next book reading, but I did read this somewhat recently. So, for those of you who don't know, have not read Little Heaven and don't want spoilers, we're going to be very careful about that. But basically, to me, a lot of the criticism about the book has been that it is basically a rehash of Stephen King, and both you and I didn't feel that way.
I didn't feel that way at all. I think maybe there are shades of King, but if you really think about how many books Stephen King has written at this point, and how many other writers are out there who have read King at some point in their lives, shades of King are going to show up regardless. But not
He's the world's best-selling author.
Yeah, but to accuse Nick Cutter of basically just rehashing King, I think is lazy and not really giving the book enough credit. As somebody who grew up reading King and I respect and I love King, I'm not a huge King fan at this point, so I never felt as if Cutter were ripping him off. There's definitely, there's definitely ideas that we've seen in other King books, but I don't buy into it. I don't buy into it's a ripoff of Stephen King.
If anything,
idea.
and I agree with you that that it is a lazy criticism. And we just looked at the Lit Reactor review, and it basically just demoted the book as to nothing but copying Stephen King. And if anything, that you and I both feel that the book has much more shades of Robert McCammon and early Clive Barker, really, than Stephen King.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, I would say the supernatural elements of the novel are very Clive Barker, just in the way they're realized. And also, I mean, the book comes with illustrations, which, Barker would do his own illustrations, but in a lot of ways, that element of the book almost gave it a more Barker feel. But another thing that I felt that reminded me of Clive Barker is just the whole cult and the Little Heaven compound reminded me of the cult at the beginning of Lord of Illusions. And I thought of them a lot when I was reading the book and that imagery. So, in that sense, I felt like it was a little bit more Clive Barker. But here's the funny thing. In the Lit Reactor review, they basically said that Little Heaven was a rewriting of It. And I don't even see how they can make the comparison with It other than the switching timelines. That's the only thing. I mean, like the setting couldn't be more different. New Mexico to Maine. We're not talking about children. We're talking about mercenaries, hired killers. There's no coming of age aspect to Little Heaven, really, except for characters who are far from the main characters. But I just don't see the comparison to It at all.
I don't either, but I will. I'm going to throw you a curveball here just for the sake of debate and conversation. The one thing I do kind of agree with in the Lit Reactor review is that the main villain, Amos Fletcher, is a pretty boring stock villain. That was the one. All the chapters with him I felt were just same stock villain I've seen over and over again. It didn't really do anything for me. I almost wish that he had been a good preacher who brought these people to this place they thought was going to be paradise and ended up inadvertently taking them into the mouth of hell, and him having to psychologically deal with that, I think would have been better than having a frothing at the mouth, angry, crazy preacher character.
Sure, and I can see that, and it was clear that Cutter very intentionally wanted Amos to be a stand-in for Jim Jones.
Well, yeah, he mentions it at the end of the book.
Yeah, he mentions it at the end of the book, but which maybe should have been in the spoiler section. But
well, it's in like it's like the acknowledgments.
Yeah.
So
well, and look, I mean, I can see what you're saying, and I think one of the reasons why Amos came off as not necessarily as strong of a character is that when you have characters like Ebenezer and Micah and Minnie, like these are very strong characters, and they all are very interesting and have strong backgrounds. Mm-hmm. So I think that kind of took away from the experience. So let's kind of wrap up non-spoilers for a little bit, and then we'll talk about the actual writing of the book. For me, Little Heaven, I think, is definitely my favorite Nick Cutter book, with The Troop being number 2. And I feel like, in many ways, a lot of people liked The Troop because they felt it was a throwback to the 80s classic horror novels. But to me, Little Heaven does an even better job because it so clearly has influences from both McCammon and Barker and King at times. But
yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why I like Little Heaven. And both you and I have read all 4 Nick Cutter books, so let's be clear about that when we rate them.
I mean, if I had to place it, I'm still not sure where I would put it. The Troop is always going to be my number 1. With, you're going to hate me for this, with The Acolyte being my number 2 still.
Which is my least favorite of the 4.
And then this would be my number 3, and The Deep would be my number 4. And that's not to say, and I don't know, I always feel weird.
We liked all 4.
Things. I love all 4 of those books. They're just for very different reasons. Which ones did I enjoy more, end up higher on the list than ones that I didn't. Although The Deep is awesome, especially when it starts to get really strange towards the end. I thought The Deep was brilliant.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that as well. So okay, here's your warning. We're 9 minutes into this, and
now we're gonna have some spoilers, and you can watch me fumble a bunch, so because I can't remember half the giant book.
All right, so we are officially in spoilers. So let's talk now about the writing and the structure of the book. Like, I thought the way that the movies, or the book, I thought it was really interesting that most of the conclusion happened in the past. The epilogue, Homecoming, 1980. is fairly short. And so you would think that the majority of the story would end chronologically at the end. I thought that was a really interesting choice. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
No, it made the most sense to me given how the rest of the book is structured.
yeah. And what's really funny is that it's a really interesting choice that Cutter made. That you know, so much of the horror you're thinking is coming down the line. It's coming down the line, but in the end, like the characters in the 1980 scenes, they've already experienced, you know, the majority of the horrific events. One of the things that I thought was really cool was the letter that Ebenezer sent after is it Minir? I don't even know how to say her name. Minnie. When he sends her a letter after she fails to kill him, and it says at the beginning, "How goes the war, milady? Are you sleeping well? I survived. I suppose you must know that. You can feel it as I can feel you, and Micah too." And like this letter at the end, which is a couple pages, to me was a really strong part of the end of the book. But it was postmarked from the 60s, so I mean, he wrote it like right after he survived. I don't know if that had as big of an impact on you as it did me.
I think all of the character moments before and after really bring you closer to who they are as people. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, and I didn't realize I should have like dog-eared the page that it's on, but it's when what does he call them? He calls them the handmaidens for the actual monster, right? The ones that come out and
The
take
Long
his daughter.
Walker?
Yeah, oh yeah, the Long Walker.
Yeah.
Where they stop at that carnival and or it's like a tent revival or a carnival, and basically the Long Walker coerces the crowd into nearly beating the preacher to death. But he does it in such a way that even the monster's bored of these types of antics, which I
Right.
thought was really interesting.
Yeah, the Long Walker is an excellent character, and to me, just even the descriptions, that was one of the most Clive Barker-esque
Oh, yeah, totally.
elements of the novel. That monster felt like it crawled out of a Clive Barker painting for sure, and was just really excellently realized. And all the scenes, that's a little barn.
That's Barney, not me barking.
Yeah, sorry for the barking, but
Hey, buddy, we're trying to record something.
so the Long Walker, I actually is a monster. Is the first monster in a long time that I found really creepy and unsettling, and I definitely think the Long Walker worked on every level.
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
Yeah, and so another thing that was cringeworthy was Eli, the character, one of the missing children. The whole scene with the children that were sewn together and came back at the window, just absolutely terrifying. The insects that came out of Eli's armpit. Amos killing Eli was one of my favorite scenes. I dog-eared that scene. More flies buzzed out of Eli's armpit, sluggish as if drunk, bumping into Amos's face. Amos was bigger than the boy, who was nothing but a wasted shell. Eli began to flag. His arms waved about weakly. His heels drummed on the cot. It goes on, but the scene was so powerful. I think when he kills him, it's just Amos crosses a line, and that's when we, are heading towards the end with him. I just thought that was a really fantastic moment in the book. But I think overall, I think this is. I can't believe the reviews that were saying that this was just not well written. I found this book the prose to be perfect. It kept me turning the pages. There was interesting moments. The characters were strong. I really felt it was Cutter's strongest work. But
It's definitely the one that he's, I think, put the most time and effort into the world building and the plotting. with maybe the Acolyte, because there's some twists and turns in the
The world
Acolyte,
building in
but
the Acolyte's
it's
pretty
pretty solid.
intense.
But if you look at this review here, where it ends with saying this reads like a ninth grade creative writing project, that's just absurd. That's an absurd thing to say.
Yeah, yeah,
You know.
it's a really good horror novel. Yeah, I was surprised to see Marvin Vernon, who's one of the critics I most trust, only gave it 2 stars, and I know he's a big fan of the earlier Cutter books, but I'm just really going to have to dig into it with Marvin and what he didn't like because to me, I found very little that I took aim with, and in fact, I was seething with jealousy through the most of the reading. Wanting to run to the keyboard just because I was so impressed by the book and just felt energized to write and create.
Well, listen to this opening for a review, because I think this is an important part of why this book is getting so many negative reviews and why it may be pushing people away from it. When so many people keep saying stuff like this, if Stephen King's Under the Dome felt like a greatest
Oh, I read
hits,
that one, yeah.
greatest hits rehash of his own earlier better books, the Nick Cutter's Little Heaven is a tribute cover band rendition of several of King's biggest moments. Again, so
Which we totally disagreed with, but yeah.
well, if something is familiar, I don't see a problem with it. And there's a this reminds
like a
me of
warm
McCammon.
blanket.
It reminds me of Clive Barker. It reminds me a little bit of Stephen King. But what does it matter? I guess is what I'm saying.
See, I find that to be a comforting feeling. If I'm reading a book that has elements of all these classic novels and feelings, it reminds me of reading a Robert McCammon novel, and that makes me feel good. Because, McCammon's still writing, but he's definitely slowed down and certainly doesn't. His newer books, I mean, I did love The Five, and I did have liked certain of his recent books. The Border was great, but to have a book that felt like early McCammon was awesome. And then to throw in like these elements of Clive Barker, it just, I loved it. So I felt fine with that. And I think Nick Cutter, keep doing what you're doing, bud, because, or Craig Davidson, keep doing what you're doing. I feel like he hit all the nails in the head with me. I don't know. But
I mean, for me, my biggest issue came from the fact that, and I've already kind of spoke on that I felt the villain to be pretty stock. I was more interested in the creatures that were living in the caves than what was really happening at the Little Heaven compound. Because that kind of implies a more cosmic horror element that I find personally more fascinating than, hey, here's another crazy preacher forcing everybody that follows him to commit mass suicide, which is something I've seen a bazillion times. And if we're going to hit Little Heaven with, oh, it's a ripoff of this or that, or it's too much King, then I'd say I think that's misguided. It's more that archetype is something we've seen too much of.
Yeah, well, yeah, I can see that. The Long Walker and the monsters were definitely more interesting to me than Amos, for sure.
And I would have loved to have I would have liked to have spent more time with the three mercenaries after everything happens in Little Heaven, because that just sounds way fascinating to me. And they're all dealing with it in very different ways, but yet you can tell through the writing that it's affecting all of them on a daily basis.
Right, and Ebenezer, Micah, Minnie, they could all carry books on their own.
Yeah.
The suicides with Minnie were just, I thought, a really great way as an introduction to both her and Ebenezer, in the sense because she's like almost begging him to kill her, and I think what it did was set up a level of it was a great way to set up a rogues gallery of characters. Mm-hmm. So we're almost at a 20-minute mark, so I think we can probably wrap this up. But
we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, but I think in the future when we read books, I'm probably going to babble on some of these, but we read books together. I think it's a fun way to engage with people because I think people are wanting to get an understanding of and of this book. I think even the people that again, not all of the bad reviews, but I think some of the bad reviews, people like they still wanted to get into it, and I think.
Well, I think the page count is a turnoff for a lot of people.
Yeah, which is weird because all novels used to be that long for a long time.
I'd say don't let the page count scare anyone that's
No,
interested in reading it, because I blew through it.
Yeah, I
pretty
flew
fast.
through this book too.
It's accessible. It's not condescending. It doesn't talk down to you. It's
Yeah, and kudos again to Nick Cutter for not calling the book the something. Since it took him four books to not have a Bentley Little title. So kudos on that. And I don't know, man. I think overall, obviously I thought it was a masterpiece, but so
I would say that I'm somewhere. What's in between great and a masterpiece?
great.
Yeah, so I'd say it was great. Masterpiece. I don't know about, but
Yeah,
I think it's great.
Yeah,
I think it's a really good book.
That might be a strong word, but I just I felt really strongly about. I see what you're saying about Amos, but it was fine for me. Like,
well, I mean, I don't want to. People probably tuned out at this point, I'm sure, but I'm actually interested. Is there anything you didn't like about it?
Yeah. Let me think about that. Well, yeah, the Amos thing was a little. I mean, the fact that he was directly quoting
Jim Jones.
Jim Jones, I understand why he did it. I'm okay with it, but I didn't think that was the best thing in the world. That little segment of the in between where there was just articles. I liked the letter. Obviously, I pointed that out, but some of the articles and things. That's a trope I hate. Like that's why Carrie didn't work for me as a novel.
Which I think is awesome. That's a cool way to tell stories. That's one of the biggest reasons I liked The Troop.
Right, which he did a ton of. I'm not saying I'm totally against that, but it just wasn't my favorite thing. Yeah, it could have been a little shorter, maybe. I didn't care about the length. But no, there wasn't anything that I just really didn't like. I thought it was pretty strong. I would say if I didn't like something, like The Acolyte, there was plenty I didn't like.
Which I completely disagree with, which that would have made for a better episode to listen to. But maybe one of these days you can tell everybody how you feel about The Fireman.
Oh, yeah, maybe we should, we could do...
I'm not reading that anytime soon. So.
Yeah. No, I mean, because with The Acolyte, I just couldn't get equilibrium out of my head. It just felt like... I mean, people think this is a carbon copy of things. I think The Acolyte, I still enjoyed it. I still enjoyed the book. I just felt like it.
Sure.
Was a little too reminiscent. So I'm certainly willing to criticize Mr. Cutter Davidson. Cutter Davidson.
That's a pretty cool biker name.
Yeah, he should release a book as Cutter Davidson that's half lit fiction, half 80s horror.
I'd read that.
Yeah. All right. So, anyways, so those of you who stuck it out, what the hell's wrong with you?
Yeah.
And we'll do this again.
Yeah, this was fun.
Later.